Okay, so we are exploring this concept of resting membrane potential. I've been laying the groundwork first by introducing this concept of membrane potential. Now I'm going to introduce this concept here of equilibrium potential. I'm going to address these questions. What is equilibrium potential and what factors affect equilibrium potential? So let's start with this slide right here. The membrane potential of a given cell is going to be determined by the ions that are inside and outside of that cell. That makes sense because ions are charged. So those are the guys that are going to be determining whether the outside is more positive or negative than the inside. Okay, these are the main players that we usually see in and around the cell. We have sodium ion in orange, we have chloride ion in green, we've got potassium ion here in purple, and then a variety of large anions such as proteins inside of the cell, okay? Each of those ions has its own, what we call equilibrium potential, okay? The equilibrium potential for a particular ion is the membrane potential at which it's at electrochemical equilibrium. So looking at these examples, potassium is at electrochemical equilibrium when the membrane potential is -90 millivolts. Sodium is at electrochemical equilibrium when the membrane potential is at +60 millivolts, and so on down the line. If you didn't understand that, don't worry. We're going to continue to explore this concept in the next several slides. So hopefully at the end of those slides, you'll get a better sense for what I'm saying here. We have a symbol that we use to denote equilibrium potential. It's this symbol right here. It's a capital E with a subscript ion. Okay. And just again, to address this concept of electrochemical equilibrium, basically, if the membrane potential is equal to the equilibrium potential for a particular ion, then there will not be net movement of that ion across the cell membrane. So looking here, if the membrane potential is -90 millivolts, we're not going to have any net movement of potassium across the membrane because potassium is basically at equilibrium. It's happy. There's not going to be any net movement across the membrane. Same thing here for sodium. If we have the membrane potential at +60 millivolts, then there won't be any net movement of sodium across the membrane because sodium is happy. It's at its electrochemical equilibrium, okay? Let's take a look at a couple examples to, or maybe it's just one example, this example to kind of illustrate this concept. So we're going to start with this same picture that we saw on the other slide. What we have going on in this picture is we have the same number of positive and negative charges inside and outside of the cell. So I want you to take a moment now to answer this question. You should be able to answer this question with this information here. What is the membrane potential of this cell? Go ahead and hit pause to answer that question. Oops. Okay, so you should have hopefully figured out that the membrane potential is 0. I want to remind you that the outside of the cell is always going to be 0, right? Membrane potential is the potential of the inside relative to the outside. But since the number of charges, like the net charge within the cell, is the same as outside the cell, then there's no difference. There's no charge separation, right? So the membrane potential is going to be 0. Hopefully you understood that. Moving on. let's take this example. Okay, so we have this situation here, and imagine what's going to happen if we insert a potassium channel into the membrane. So in this diagram right here, we don't have any channels. Take a look at where we can find potassium in the diagram, and then think about what would happen to potassium if we were to add a potassium channel into this membrane here. So go ahead and answer that question on your worksheet. Okay, so hopefully you figured out that if we inserted a potassium channel into the membrane, potassium would follow its concentration gradient and move out of the cell, right? So we have a whole bunch of potassium here, no potassium outside of the cell. That potassium is going to follow its concentration gradient and move out of the cell. However, let's take a look now at how that has affected the electrical situation around the cell and the membrane potential, right? So actually, I want you to think about this, right? So if we've had a potassium ion move out of the cell, what effect has that had on the membrane potential? What has it done to the membrane potential? And then thinking about it from an electrical perspective, what then does that do to potassium movement? So go ahead and hit pause, think about that, and answer those questions there. All right, so hopefully you figured out that if we have potassium moving out of the cell here, that's going to now make the inside of the cell more negative than the outside. So membrane potential is going to become negative. Then if we take a look at how that affects this particular potassium ion here, right, we know that opposite charges attract. So if the inside of the cell is negative, that's going to attract this positive potassium ion back inside the cell. That's kind of crazy, right? So we have this kind of push-pull, right? The concentration gradient is telling potassium to leave the cell. The electrical gradient is telling potassium to come into the cell. What do we do with that? That is what is addressed in this concept of electrochemical equilibrium. Okay, so each ion is going to have two different forces acting on it. It's going to have electrical forces acting on it, and it's going to have chemical forces acting on it, right? So an ion is a molecule. It's going to follow its concentration gradient, but it's also a charged particle that's going to follow electrical forces. So how do we reconcile these two opposing concepts? We reconcile that with an equation, okay? So we have this equation called the Nernst equation that takes into account both the electrical gradient and the chemical gradient that's working on an ion, okay? And when you plug these various values into this equation, you get the equilibrium potential for that ion. And I want to remind you, the equilibrium potential is basically the potential at which the electrical and the chemical forces on that ion are equal to each other. That's where the ion will be at equilibrium. I do want to say a few things about this equation. One, I do not expect you to memorize this equation or even to work with it. I've decided that it's much more important to have you understand conceptually the concept that is embodied within this equation rather than having you do a bunch of calculations. But I do want to point out that the equation does sort of embody these concepts that we've been talking about, right? It's going to represent both electrical and chemical forces. And you can see that in the terms that are in the equation. So you can see that we have concentrations outside of the cell, the extracellular concentration. We have the concentration of the ion inside of the cell. So that kind of addresses the chemical gradient that we have going on. And then we also have this electrical factor here, Z, which is the charge of the ion. Okay, so all of those things go into this equation, and the number that we get out from the equation is the membrane potential at which that ion is happiest, where it's at equilibrium.